This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com. Virginia hospitals and health systems provide jobs. They support our economy and promote public health. Local hospitals are always open to help people with unexpected health needs. Having a stable healthcare network is vital. Virginia hospitals are our lifeline.
It's amazing what my students with special needs can accomplish. Their pride is priceless. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a very special welcome back to Dr. Steve Staples. Appreciate your being here. It's been a while.
It has,
lots
but it's
of
a
things
pleasure.
are happening in education. As our viewers would know, you're the Superintendent of Public Instruction for the Commonwealth, and you have a history of practically 40 years in public education.
I wish you hadn't pointed that out, David, but that is true.
You started right young and continue to be young.
If that were only the case.
Working on that both as a teacher, a principal, an assistant superintendent, a superintendent, working faculty at the College of William and Mary, and working with the Association of Superintendents. And Governor McAuliffe said, we need you to be the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And this time right now is a really hot time in public education as far as everything that's happening. So I've got some notes about some things to ask you, but I'd rather you start with what's really at the top of your agenda here this fall. We'll tell our viewers we're having this conversation on Halloween. There's nothing scary about public education at all. They'll be seeing the show in November and much before the time the General Assembly convenes, but there's work that's happening at the Board of Education, Department of Education, so it's all yours to start bringing us up to speed.
I greatly appreciate that, and I hope today's session is much more of a treat than a trick. So
yes,
I thank you
absolutely.
for that. But I think it's an interesting time. We say to folks that I think Virginia, in many ways, is kind of leading the conversation around what education might be in the 21st century versus an extension of what education has been in the preceding centuries. And you see that in the state board's work. Just a couple of the high-profile ones. The state board is bringing to closure some discussions around what we call the profile of a graduate.
Yes.
The notion of what should high school students know, be able to demonstrate, and have been exposed to during their high school career in a way that connects them to what comes next, be that military service, employment, further education. And so I think those conversations are very far-reaching because they force us to rethink about what's the most critical, or what are the most critical aspects of high school. As they do that, that certainly informs how we assess students. Because if we want to make sure that students are gaining the knowledge, being able to demonstrate the things, then we have to figure out how do we properly assess that they've done that in a way that gives us some confidence that they've met those standards and are prepared. And of course, I guess finally that leads us to, well, then how do we hold schools accountable? How do we resource them? How do we make sure that they have the resources they need in order to do the work? And then how do we hold them accountable in a way that's fair and equitable and kind of aligns with what we want them to do? So other than that, David, it's a pretty quiet time.
Right. Yes, well, on the profile of the graduate, you mentioned 3 different tracks that someone might move into life-wise, not educational tracks
Yes,
necessarily. How would you describe the difference in the profile of a graduate if the graduate's going this direction for military, immediately getting employment, or are looking to go for more education right at that time? Does the profile differ for each of those?
I think the expectations don't differ, but the pathways that students use to get there
Yes,
differ.
yes.
The idea is that there isn't one what comes next after high school, so everybody shouldn't be on the same path. The notion
Yes.
that we prepare everybody the same way kind of implies that all the outcomes are the same, and they're not. So before the state board did this work, they sat down with 24 different stakeholder groups. Some of them creators of high school graduates, teachers, principals, school counselors. Some of them consumers of high school graduates, the military, employers, 2-year, 4-year. And what they clearly told us was, number one, what you're doing isn't bad, it just isn't adequate. And number two, we all have differing expectations. So
Right.
for the military, they're looking for more instantly ready students who are prepared to receive specific and detailed training, but have a core of basic functioning. For our workers, for the folks going into the workforce, what the employers said was, we need different kinds of exposure. For example, you teach students to write in high school, but we have to reteach them to write in the workplace because it's more technical writing. Different kind of writing.
Yes.
Different pathway now. We're saying, okay, if that's kind of your alignment, writing as a Virginia Dominion linesman looks different than writing a 5-paragraph expository paper. And they emphasized that they understood we were teaching writing, we just weren't teaching it the way they wanted to see it taught. And then even in higher ed, the conversations were that there was some misalignment between the work that we did and the expectations they had. So that in that 2-year interim, the 2-month interim from a high school senior graduating and then
Right.
them enrolling, nothing magical was happening and they weren't always prepared. So I mean, I know that's a long answer to your question, but yeah, there are subtle differences in the pathways, but still the expectation is that students are held to that high standard.
I was reflecting earlier, knowing I'd have this conversation with you, about my high school experience at Warwick High School in Newport News.
Know it well.
And if those teachers were still around and the principals, I don't know what pathways they had in mind. Although one interesting part that I still recall, that I was the only male student taking typing. And I think there was a definite pathway that they were encouraging young women at that
Yes.
time to
Yes, we
prepare
saw
for. I will say, thanks to the ones who taught me typing, that was probably one of the most helpful courses I had in high school as I moved into higher ed after that, because I could type my papers.
Well, you know, it's interesting you would say that, because when we engage with these audiences, what we found out was one of the items missing in kind of our portfolio of expectations for high school was the opportunity in practical skill application. The notion that regardless of which one of those pathways you're going to take, the opportunity to apply that in a real life setting or in a practical manner was important. And we heard it from deans of schools of engineering, and we heard it from military recruiters.
Interesting.
And so we're not talking about kind of sorting and separating students to say, oh, well, you know, you're going to do this and you're going to do the other. Certainly there'll be some specificity, but when the state board talks about exposing high school students to career planning, this isn't just for students that think they'll begin work immediately after high school. These are for students who are thinking they really won't begin work until after they've earned a master's degree. But that early career planning is important because it helps them understand the preparation pathway they need to take in order to be ready for that career. So your typing is a great example. I think you'll see more of that, in the sense that we really want students to be able to demonstrate and practically apply some of those skills.
Yeah. As I reflect on grandchildren being savvy with computers at a very young age, but not with the keyboard.
Yes.
Not,
Yes.
not with the keyboard.
That's correct.
And I'm not faulting the schools on that, but somehow they pick up everything on all the smart devices, but not the way to do 40 or 50 or 60 words a minute.
Well, you bring up, I think, an extremely interesting point for us, because I think part of our discussion around profile of a graduate, and I should make it clear that the board is beginning that discussion and will come to some closure on kind of the first stage. But we don't think the discussion will end with the
Right,
first stage.
right.
But one of the areas of discussion is to redefine what is it to be a literate citizen in the 21st century, because literacy has a different connotation. Certainly numeracy, certainly writing, reading,
Yeah.
but probably more than that. To really be a literate citizen in the 21st century requires some sense of computer literacy, because the technology is so pervasive in our lives. I mean, on my phone in my pocket, I have more computing power than the Apollo moon mission,
Yes.
and literally in my pocket. So, helping students understand both the limitations and the capacity of that likely makes them more literate, and it may well redefine what we mean by literacy for the 21st century.
Speak a little bit about high school redesign, and I think you probably already have, because there's got to be some intersection between the profile of a graduate and high school redesign, but those are words heard here around the General Assembly and around Capitol Square, and I'm sure a great deal in the Department of Education.
They absolutely are, and I jokingly tell people that we redesign high schools on a regular cycle. It's once every 100 years. Because the high schools that we operate today operate much as they did in the 20th and certainly the 19th century. And what we're helping people understand is that high school design produces a graduate prepared to do certain things, and some of those things no longer exist. We don't need high school graduates to fire the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution's done. So as we talk about the high school redesign, we're talking about how we prepare students for the life ahead of them, not the life behind us. And that means a different preparation, and it probably means more personalized instruction. Our economy in years past could allow some folks to do very well, some folks to do okay, and some folks not to do so okay, and there were places for them to go into work, build a quality living, and raise a family. That's not the case anymore. Our workforce doesn't really have places for unskilled, uneducated workers. So we can't have a system that moves everybody through same amount of time, same subjects, same number of days, because we're going to get differing outcomes. Some people can be prepared, some people aren't. So I think as we look at high school redesign, the simplest in our time format here is to say we're really looking at a more personalized approach to high school so that students can engage individually in moving through their preparation. So if I can complete Algebra 1 in a semester, I shouldn't take 180 days to do it. I ought to complete it in a semester and move on. And that's going to require high schools to really rethink how they're organized and how they engage students in content.
It's exciting. It's exciting, I'm sure challenging too for the ones that are there teaching and the principals and everyone in the process.
It is very challenging. I think what we get consistently from folks is that they are excited, anxious, and worried simultaneously.
Yes.
Because they certainly embrace, most do, the idea of the change. They recognize this is something that's needed. But we like to separate it from saying they agree with the what, they wonder about the how. How are we going to do this? How are we going to restructure it? Thankfully, we've got 10 high school grants out there right now where high schools are functioning in an innovative way to say, what would you do differently? And our plan is, after a couple of years of operation, they become models so that other high schools in Virginia can visit and say, how are you doing that?
Yes.
How would that inform my context? And how could we then adopt some of what you're doing and help it plan for what we do differently?
Some of the other words heard a great deal are career and technical ed. So that fits into the profile or to the redesign in some ways?
It absolutely does, with the idea that in the profile, all students should be planning ultimately to enter the workforce. So we're talking workplace skills, and career and tech ed has been doing that for years, helping students understand the translation from school to work. We're saying all students in high school should understand workplace skills because eventually we hope they are all going to work.
Yes.
And then the career planning piece. How do we do it? Interestingly, career tech ed also is much more of a competency-based approach where we can clearly define what are the competencies you need to demonstrate in order to complete kind of this level of preparation. Well, competency-based is becoming of interest in mathematics, in science, in social studies. We're talking much more skill and application, and I think our career tech programs can show us models to do that in other content areas.
In very recent days, the changes proposed by the Board of Education on standards of quality have been making news, and of course some of the news that gets made in the headlines has to do with the cost. Help us understand how this is, again, something it happens more frequently than every 100 years. It's quite frequently that those standards of qualities, or SOQs as they're sometimes referred to, are proposed changes frequently.
The SOQs really drive the core staffing, and that's the piece we're focusing on. There's a lot more to the SOQs than that. But the standards of quality drive the core staffing that across the state we say these are basic. This is the basic level. You've got to, every school needs to achieve this. Well, I think the state board read and embraced what they saw as both their constitutional and their codified responsibility that says those standards should be embedded in what we believe are the important aspects of a quality education. And that means they need to be connected to reality. So what the state board has responded to is changes in our student population. You know, David, it's hard to believe, but 40% of the students in Virginia's public schools today come from backgrounds in poverty. That is significantly higher than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so the state board is saying children coming from those backgrounds need different kinds of support, and I think you see some of that reflected in the standards of quality, particularly for children who've experienced trauma. And we have more and more traumatized children in our schools, some because of family environmental circumstances, some because of the neighborhoods they grow up in. The other aspect of it is, if we're in fact going to produce graduates who are ready for these next steps, they may require more intensive services, and school counselors that are proposed in there are a good example of that. So I think the state board said, as we read the Constitution, as we read the code, our job is to purvey what is needed. Others can determine what is possible. And I think they embrace that with the recommendations you see in the SOQ. And clearly, there will be hard choices to make, and they understand that. But I think they felt strongly that their mission was to say, this connects to reality, and this delivers on what we think are the basic educational guarantees constitutionally in Virginia.
Speak of some of the other standards of accreditations, SOA, as people will see those letters at times, and proposed changes that you see taking place in the standards of accreditation.
Yeah, I think that's exciting, because what schools said to us was, if you're going to hold us accountable for something different, then the system ought to look a little different. Currently, accreditation is based almost entirely on the output of your scores on SOL tests. Now we need to keep those. It's not that we're saying SOL testing should go away or that accountability connected to it should go away, because those assessments really do give us good information. Can children read? Can they do numeracy? The problem is those assessments may not be appropriate for all of the things we want schools to do. So if we want schools to build engaged citizens, not just citizens who know the 3 branches of government, but engaged and active, that may require an authentic assessment where they actually engage in a real world problem. That'll be part of the accountability system. So I think what the board is saying is there more, not a replacement for SOL tests as the core of accountability, but is there more that we could build onto? And I think some folks will be surprised because some hear reform in accountability as an elimination of accountability.
That's
Frankly,
yeah,
I don't think that's the case. When
yeah.
you look at what the state board is proposing, I think they're going to hold schools accountable in an even broader way that is more rigorous accountability than what we have now.
As you look across the Commonwealth, and are there common denominators found among the schools that are having difficulty being accredited right now? And beyond that, what can the state do, or is it up to the localities to try to get those schools to where they will be accredited?
To the first part, clearly each school is a unique setting, but there are some typically common factors that we can apply to schools that are struggling to meet accreditation standards. I think the most significant one is they have significant challenges in staffing. They have higher teacher turnover. They have fewer applicants. They have more open positions in critical areas. So when we're talking about you need to improve student outcomes in mathematics, and we look at the school, we find out that they have the fewest number of highly qualified math teachers and the most number of substitutes filling in on a math class. Well, that's not a great recipe to improve your math outcomes. We need highly qualified math teachers there. So I think that's one common factor. The other is that they typically have more challenging student bodies. They have more students from poverty, more students from backgrounds that typically don't correlate to student performance in our schools. With that in mind, yes, I think the state has an obligation to level that playing field. If we really want all of our students to be prepared for life in the 21st century and to be contributing workers in the 21st century, then we've got to find a way to compensate for the inequities. So it doesn't matter if you come from a home in poverty or not, we've got to find a way to give you experiences that allow you to meet those competencies, not change them. We don't want to lower the standards.
Right.
We don't want to water them down because that's graduation that's meaningless. But we got to find a way to help support students and make up for the experiences that they need so they can meet those standards. And I think you see that in some of the SOQ proposals, and you'll certainly see it in the accountability piece.
Before our time's up, and we got a couple more minutes, what have I not asked you about, or what have you not brought up? What's something else you want to tell us?
David, as always, you're very comprehensive. I think maybe the last piece we want folks to know, looming out kind of on the fringe, but clearly involved in all of the work we've talked about, is the federal plan around Every Student Succeeds Act. And clearly we're working to create and craft reform in Virginia that doesn't conflict with the requirements in ESSA. I think one of the benefits of ESSA, one of the biggest benefits, is we've learned a lesson, and that is that the federal government probably can't micromanage every detail of how we improve schools. And in many cases, No Child Left Behind had the federal government providing details that didn't always make sense in the context. Thankfully, ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, says to the states, we're going to allow you to craft some of those reforms, and you are better suited to contextualize it to schools in Southwest Virginia versus schools in urban Richmond. And both may need support, help, and improvement, but they don't look the same. As we work through all these reform efforts, the profile of a graduate, the redesign of high school, changing accountability, the SOQ, we're doing it through the lens of making sure that the state plan that we craft conforms and collaborates with ESSA so we don't set up a competing system. You know, what we don't need anymore is our stakeholders confused because a school is fully accredited but did not make AYP, or is a priority school but fully accredited. That makes no sense, and that doesn't communicate to anybody what they need to know about the school. So I just want folks to rest assured, although we don't talk as much about ESSA, it is certainly kind of the background scenario in all the work that we're doing.
Dr. Staples, thank you so much for being on This Week in Richmond, and our viewers can see that DOE, Department of Education, .virginia.gov to get more information.
We look forward to their engagement. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community. For jobs, the economy, and public health, Virginia Hospitals, our lifeline.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.